You're listening to the Digital Child Podcast, brought to you by the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child.
Hello, hi, Wamanjika, welcome. My name is Kate Mannell. I'm a research fellow at Deakin University in the Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child, and it is my absolute pleasure to be hosting this event today on behalf of the Digital Child Centre. 2 months ago, the US Surgeon General issued a public health advisory about the impact of modern stresses on parents' mental health. This advisory is essentially the US Surgeon General sounding an alarm that parents in the US are not okay, that the level of stress that many parents are facing is seriously impacting them and their families, of course including their children. Some of the causes that advisory points to are relatively distinct to the US, so a lack of family support policy, in particular lack of parental leave. But it also points to some causes that are around cultural issues, which in many ways also apply here and in other kinds of similar countries. And so the advisory calls for shifts in norms around raising children. There's a range of these different kind of cultural challenges that the Surgeon General identifies, including parenting in a context where the future is very uncertain, and in a context where parenting has become a very time-intensive activity and expectations around children's achievement have increased. These kinds of observations are supported by a lot of historical and sociological research that has charted the rise in what it terms intensive parenting. This is essentially the idea that raising children has become a much more resource-intensive activity, time, money, labour, so on. At the same time, that it has also become much more the sole responsibility of parents, as opposed to a responsibility that's more broadly shared. What does any of this have to do with screen time? What a weird place to start. I actually think that this advisory from the Surgeon General is a helpful illustration of the kind of framing that I want to bring to this conversation. Young children's use of screen media is a topic where parents can feel a lot of pressure, they can feel judgment, they can feel guilt, maybe even shame, and I want to try to take that really seriously, particularly given this broader context where expectations around what's involved in raising a child have become so heightened. There's a lot of talk about kids and screens or digital technology more broadly, but I think there's much less talk about what that means for parents, and this is what I'm hoping we're going to grapple with this evening. I want to note that we have seen some improvement in the kind of conversation around young children and screens. For a very long time, the public health advice to parents in this area was focused very much on giving time limits that are based on a child's age, so no screen time for under twos and so on. This has started to shift, partly due to a pushback against the lack of evidence to support specific time-based, age-based time limits. Partly in recognition that, of course, there's more to children's screen use than just time. There's also questions of content. What is a child doing? What are they looking at? And what is the context? What is the context, the environment around that, the rest of the child's day, so on and so forth. And also part of the pushback against these guidelines has been the fact that no one could meet them anyway. So there have been a few examples of significant organisations updating these guidelines in response to these shifts and trying to take a much more flexible approach that accounts for the specific circumstances of a child, of a family, of different types of screen use. Despite this, though, my own sense is that a lot of the discourse around children and screens is still very dominated by quite a kind of limited and dogmatic set of ideas. The Australian guidelines, for example, are still only concerned with time limits because they're situated within advice about physical activity. I'm also doing a project as part of my work at the Digital Child Centre, which is looking at discourse around young children's screen time in places like TikTok parenting advice, videos and news reporting. And what I found through that research is a lot of very intense, very emotive, very rigid advice about children's screen time, often framed in very high stakes terms around harms. There's a lot of very conflicting advice, and there's a lot of women with perfect hair talking about their kind of no screen time households. I've also done a lot of work reviewing research around children's digital media use and have been quite frustrated by the amount of quite poor quality research that gets a lot of media attention. And so I guess my point is that my hunch is that all of this is not particularly helpful for parents. So that's where I want to focus our discussion this evening. Where is the conversation at around children and screens? To what extent does this conversation connect to parents' actual concerns and experiences? To what extent does it create new anxieties and pressures that maybe wouldn't be there otherwise? And how can we have some better conversations that meet parents where they're at and that take into account this wider landscape that I've tried to point to of contemporary parenting, where a lot is being asked of parents. I could not be more delighted to be welcoming and introducing our panellists for today. Furthest away from me on the end there, we have Fiona Holder. Fiona is an early years facilitator and disability advocate. She's the program coordinator at Playgroup Victoria, and for the past 5 years has also been facilitating Play Connect Plus playgroups, which are designed for children with additional needs. Fiona is also a mum to 3 children with autism and a range of other diagnoses, and she draws on this lived experience to support children with disabilities, developmental delays, and chronic illnesses together with their families. Next to Fiona, we have Dr. Billy Garvey. Billy is a dad, a podcaster, an author, and a developmental paediatrician with over 20 years' experience working with children and families in a number of settings. He's also the founder of Guiding Growing Minds, a social enterprise that's dedicated to the future of our kids. Across these various roles, Billy's work is focused on helping those who care for kids, whether that's parents, educators, sports coaches, clinicians, or so on, by advancing their ability to guide healthy child development and mental health. And next to Billy, we have Daniel Donahue. Daniel is the Digital Innovation Manager at Project Rocket, where he oversees the development of resources and services for students, teachers, and parents. Daniel works at the intersection of play, technology, and learning, and has designed alternate reality games, worked with top educational app designers, and supported education and learning teams at Lego, Disney, and Apple. He's also a father of 4 boys and the author of 2 books on parenting, Idolizing Children and Ad-Proofing Your Kids. So a brilliant kind of range of expertise and experience to bring to this conversation. Thank you so much for coming along and joining me. Before we kind of jump into the weeds, I want to start with this term screen time itself, because I've gone back and forth a lot on whether or not to use it in this event. In my own research context, it doesn't really get used anymore, partly because it's very vague. Even researchers can't decide what counts as screen time. And it also has that pesky word time in it, which kind of contributes to that overemphasis on time that a lot of researchers are trying to get away from. On the other hand, though, screen time is still commonly used as a term in a lot of other research, and it's kind of common vernacular. It's language that people often use when they talk about kids and technology, kids and screen use. So I want to ask 2 questions. Where does this term screen time come from? And Dan, I think you're happy to talk to that. And then maybe for Billy and Fiona, in the context of the work that you do with families, is this a term that comes up, that gets used? And do you see that as an issue, or is the language that we use actually not that important here?
Thanks, Kate. Can I just say too, as a sort of starting point too, like within the context of parenting and those who support parents and do that kind of work, the ability to talk about the concept of worrying about whether or not your child is spending too much time on the screen is an extremely privileged thing, really. Like we're in a certain space when we talk about these things, and I just think we should sort of think about that when we have these conversations too. I didn't think I'd still be here in 2024 having this sort of conversation. I've been probably talking about the concept of screen time for 20 odd years. I think its origins really go back properly in terms of the policy space and the way we're even talking about it today to around 1992, when the American Association of Paediatricians first developed their first model for a screen time policy. And that's where that model of no screen for children under the age of 2, half an hour for 1 to 2, 1 hour, that was the bedrock for that kind of thinking. And they have a media and sort of group of paediatricians that sort of think about those things and make those issues. And then they reviewed that again in 1999 and 2004 and 2011. And the landscape had changed from like households with 1 or 2 televisions, a black and white one in parents' bedroom and the other one in the main living area, through to, by 2011 we were talking about iPads and all of these kinds of things, and we all were carrying around screens in our pockets, and households had, well-off households had a whole range of different screens. And it was at that point that they had one of the members of that committee, Dr. Dimitri Christakis, sort of wrote a piece for the JAMA Pediatrics Journal where he talked about the fact of maybe it's changed a little bit. Maybe the way children are interacting with these things that are iPads and tablets and those kinds of things means we have to rethink this a little bit. And the American Association of Pediatricians put out a piece, I think it was around 2014 and 2016. They sort of reviewed the policy. And one of the lines they ran with was, we can no longer rely on the precautionary principle. We have to actually use evidence-based and science, which means to say that the concept of screen time and the way we've been thinking about it and the way it's entered the public consciousness since 1992 was based on the Hippocratic Oath of, like, do no harm. And so therefore, and my suggestion was, at that time when I was doing some writing for some different groups, was that, well, actually it did do harm. Because if you were a PhD student in the late 90s and you were wanting to explore how parents and children would understand the internet together, or how young children could watch television and play computer games with parents and what that would look like, there would be very few institutions that would allow you to do that, because an ethics committee would just look at that sort of standard from the American Association of Pediatricians that had been adopted by departments of health in Britain and Australia and other Western nations and be like, well, we can't. And so we sort of have had this vacuum over a really long period of time. Why the Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child is so important is there just is a vacuum of evidence. There's a vacuum of understanding. And the fact that we continue to use screen time baffles me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All I heard was it's all paediatricians' fault.
The American paediatricians, Billy, you're fine.
So no, but it's interesting about the guidelines because, yeah, I did a talk maybe 10 years ago. I remember, the only reason I remember is I had 3 talks. I had to do PD on severe behavioural difficulties in kids at the RCH where I work. I then went to the Melbourne Graduate School of Education and spoke to teachers, and then I went to the South Bank Library. I spoke to teachers about neurodiversity, and then I went and spoke to the public about child mental health. And through the day, the talks were getting easier because the paediatricians were like, I know everything. And then the educators wanted to learn, and the teachers were like, how can we help? And I remember I had a slide up that just had the title Screen Time, and this dad stood up in the middle of the audience and was like, we are so sick of being screen shamed. And I'll never forget it. Thank God what I went on was about how useless screen time is, and the joke is, that the guidelines say that 0 to 2 is no time, 2 to 5 is 1 hour, and above 5, 2 hours max. And the joke is that the research shows that 90% of people aren't compliant with that, and 10% of people lie about how compliant they are. It's so difficult. Like at the moment, my 3-year-old will be on a screen so that her mum can make her dinner, so that I can do this talk. Like we're all just trying to function, and I think it's a really important frame. And I know Fiona will speak to this as well from a really good perspective of like, how do we actually do this in a way that understands the evidence around child development, but also looks at our kids and thinks, actually, how are they going? And that's what I do. My daughter gets her hair brushed every night watching Spider-Man cartoons. It doesn't mean that she struggles to fall asleep. Sleep hygiene would say that's a bad move. If she struggled to fall asleep because of doing that, we would stop doing it because we would watch her and how she's going. Like it's interesting nuance, and I agree with you. It's crazy that we still talk about it, but I think it's because simple messages are easier to pick up about not doing this. And then the risk is that there's so much shame around it, and a lot of the evidence shows us that how good you are as a parent is determined by how good you feel you are as a parent. And so we've got to remember that if ourselves are feeling shameful about using screens, or we're unintentionally shaming other people, we risk that we're really damaging how they feel about it in terms of how they're going. And that's probably a good point for you to talk to some of your experiences.
Yeah, so the families that I work with, Kate has mentioned, I help to support children and families with disability, developmental delays and chronic illness. So the term screen time, we actually don't use it in my space at work, and the reason for that is because the screen actually plays a really integral role in speech development in a lot of cases, but also when you've got a child that's dysregulated or perhaps burnt out, sometimes the screen can actually be very, very helpful in terms of them calming down and taking the time they need in order to be able to engage in an activity or re-engage with their families. So I try to actually build parents' capacity to, step away from the word shame and those screen time shames that come with it, because the screen actually plays an integral part in the day-to-day of the family running of the children that I work with. I think that's probably the best way to describe it. And I am a mum of kids with disability, and it certainly plays a huge part in my children's life. And I agree exactly with what you said. My kids are in the city tonight so that I can be here, and they were on tablets on the way here just so they could survive the next couple of hours out and about while I'm here tonight. So. And something I said earlier, I actually don't use screen time. It's never been a currency in my house. I don't use it as a reward. I also don't use it as, if there is a consequence, perhaps for a poor choice, the tablet does not play a part in that because it actually has a much bigger function at my house. Yeah.
Cool. So what I'm hearing is that screen time has a bit of baggage as a term, and maybe kind of oversimplifies or flattens some of the complexity that's involved in screen use, which I'm sure is something we'll get into more. So the audience can just apply scare quotes whenever we use the term screen time. In my kind of introduction there, I painted quite a probably bleak picture of discourse around young children and screen time, and you've all spoken now to where your kind of own perspectives are at, but I want you to tell us a little bit about how you see the kind of messaging that's available to parents or being directed at families at the moment around children and screen use. Is it kind of as crappy as I've suggested? Is it better than that? How do you see it from your perspectives?
I can jump in if you like. I think it is pretty damaging. I think families have enough to manage anyway without feeling shame and pressure around, screen usage at their own home. And I think we talked about it a bit earlier as well. I think each family runs completely differently, and it would be pretty remiss to actually try and have a cookie cutter approach to screen times as well. And I think parents now, there's lots of pressures and, both parents are working and you're doing lots of things. And I think to add one more level of shame to guilt that you're probably carrying anyway, it just isn't helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I've got the privilege of meeting a lot of kids in clinic, and I learn a lot from them, and it guides my own parenting probably more than the research does, to be honest. Yeah, and the interesting thing is I meet a lot of kids who, screens allow them to be creative, they allow them to connect. I meet a lot of autistic kids that the only friendships they have are ones that are online.
I agree.
And I would never take that away from them, and I would reinforce it actually, because they're learning social skills, it's securing their self-esteem, it's doing all these amazing things. And yeah, I convinced my partner about 8 years ago that I needed to buy Fortnite because all the kids realised they didn't know what I was talking about. And I've actually got so much credibility in clinic now outside of that. And I literally, on my to-do list, is to start playing Minecraft because they see right through me when I'm like, are you
can join my server, it's okay.
But it's an important thing. It's this opportunity of connection, including with our kids. Like my daughter literally could not brush her hair 3 months ago, and for some reason some kid which is great, but some kid at daycare has convinced her that Spider-Man's cool, and now she only wears Spider-Man clothes, has a Spider-Man outfit, everything like that, and now it's a positive experience brushing her hair. She sits in my lap, we watch Spidey, and her mum brushes her hair, and it's just, I get an hour a day at the most with her, and that's part of it. And it's gone from a terrible moment to one that's nice because of a screen and because of that. So I think it's really important we think about that. And I think it's like, as much as I'm joking, how do we share those spaces with kids? Because we also need to know what they're watching, what they're doing, what they're seeing, how they feel about it, making sure they can come to us, we can talk to them. Because all of us, like you guys are already in this space, but this is how you learn about social media. This is how you learn about, consent. This is how you learn about how to navigate that space. It's like learning to drive a car. If we just ignore it, and then go, here are your keys, good luck, see ya. Like we don't. We talk about it and we show them. It's like learning how to ride a bike. We help them learn, and when they fall down, they come to us, we celebrate them, like all of that stuff.
There's going to be no conflict on this panel if that's what you were looking for, because at Project Rocket, the parenting sessions that we run are really called Parenting in a Digital World. Again, because it's so much more than just a screen, right? It's and the focus again is broadly on that idea of like you were saying, Billy, like we often talk about blocking or limiting time, all the rest, all these, like a lot of it's built around safety. We have a commissioner of e-safety, right? But the biggest protective factor as a parent for your child is the relationship that you have with them. When you say come to us, That's one of the key messages that we send in the thing. It's like, you don't want to use technology as the bad guy, because as your children grow, and we do a lot of work with older primary school and secondary school's children, it's like, if your child has a problem, you want them to come to you, right? And if they think you're going to be angry, or they think you're going to take your phone away or their tablet or not let them have access to the computer, they're not going to come to you. So you actually need to find a way, when you're parenting children in this environment now that has all these devices, to somehow quieten the noise around people who just want to take that diametrically opposed technology, good, bad. It's not. It's a thing that's there that we need to spend time with and work with. And so I think that's the thing that I understand. It's a simple idea and all the rest of it, but in work that I did a few years ago with the Alana and Madeline Foundation during the pandemic, and we went in, we sort of put all these families into a Facebook group and said, hey, can we ask you provocations, and can you capture what life's like at home in lockdown with all of these screens and all the rest of it? It was really interesting. When we codified that data, there was very little talk of screen time, and everyone talked about scrolling. Like, there's a shared understanding that there's an experience of technology that is productive and useful and beneficial, and then there's a time when it's not. The young people that I work with at our National Youth Collective call it bed rot, or bed rotting. And that's that point where we all have, where we're just sort of aimlessly scrolling and feeling like it's got beyond being good for us. And it seemed to be the families in that project could agree on that. And they weren't all talking with each other either. These concepts were coming from, far north Queensland and Adelaide. And so my thinking is that, yes, that wherever those messages around the simplicity of a message of screen time are coming from, they're not beneficial or useful for parents. They are the shaming device.
Yeah, they are. And it offers no value.
Yeah.
Doesn't offer any
doesn't
information.
help you be a better parent.
No, absolutely.
I want to just ask a quick kind of follow-up question here. Like, to what so you've kind of shared, you've suggested that you do still see that there is some kind of unhelpful commentary, or some very black and white, or some very talking about harms. But I want to try and get a little bit more at the sense of, like, to what extent do you think that's still dominating the conversation? So the views that you've shared, it's great for a paediatrician to learn about Fortnite so that I can work with my clients or whatever. Do you feel like those are still kind of, the views and perspectives that each of you have shared are still counter to the kind of dominant
Oh yeah, most
view?
of my colleagues would disagree with me about the way that I approach this stuff. And I'm not saying it's not harmful. Like, there's a vulnerability in it. Just like that's really a good point. The passive versus active views. We see kids that are active, they're contributing. It's a creative outlet, it's social connection, and then all of us, like, the more stressed I am, the more I've got on, the more times in an hour I'll pick up my phone and check stuff. But that's a symptom of me struggling with something. And it's the same. If I meet a kid in clinic who was playing sports, or used to spend time with dad, or was attending school, we're still seeing kids every week who haven't gone back to school since the pandemic.
Yeah, it's true.
And they're on screens a lot. That's a symptom that a kid is struggling. You know what I mean? And it's not a point of, well, take the screen away from them. It's address why they're struggling, because their self-esteem is insecure. They have suicidal thoughts. They're you know what I mean? Like, it's silly to just, like you said, Dan, like, just take it away and be like, well, you've stopped going to school, or you've stopped playing sports or whatever. I'm just going to take this away from you. And it's a very primitive approach to supporting kids that are struggling.
Did you want to talk at all, Fiona, to what those kind of dominant messages are?
Yeah, look, in the space that I work within, I don't allow it to actually be the dominating level of discussion, because I am in the business of trying to build capacity within families, and I actually don't think allowing that to actually take the lead is actually helpful to them.
Do you think you're unusual in that?
Maybe. I think the fact that I have lived experience to support it is probably very helpful for my approach. I mean, we were just chatting before, I was chatting with Dan actually. One of my boys wasn't going to engage in an activity, and I found that the iPad has been particularly useful if his anxiety is such that he can't engage in things unless he knows every last little bit about them. So being able to research, being able to show him a footprint of something, being able to really let him immerse himself into a space before he's able to go into it has meant that he can leave the house, has meant that he can, he also has medication for his anxiety. But it has built his capacity. So I will never be on the... I agree with what you were saying before, though. You do have to watch the content, and as children get older, you have to be pretty savvy with understanding technology. But in the early years, as a tool in order to support children, for whatever reason it is, why wouldn't we embrace that and support it and then, look to the root of what the problems are.
But I think you are unique.
Children.
You've given that to me, standing there, and you set it up here. It's not a currency in our house.
And it never has been.
Yeah, I've never heard that said before. And I've spoken about screens
But you know what? And I can tell my kids it's time to go to bed now. No worries, put my iPad on the charge. It's never... No one's sneaking an iPad at our place. No one's...
Yeah, and totally. And there'll be people in the audience, and I've gone through that window where they really struggle to come off devices. We see a lot of those kids, but it's a skill, isn't it? And it's a skill that you've probably quite innately taught to your kids.
They've been in our house for a long time. So my twins got their first device when they were 3 as a speech device. We were mortified, to be perfectly truthful. It wasn't something we thought would happen. And, they're on to their 3rd device now, and there's been a progression in the style of device they have. But the new iPad 10 actually recognises, probably 98% of the time, my child's speech impediment, so he can voice to text anything. Or, voice search on Google for information. He knows lots of facts. He wouldn't have all of that if it weren't for the device. Yeah.
Oh, and also, I benefit. We've got nearly 10,000 people listen to our podcast yesterday. 2 weeks ago, we were the 10th biggest podcast in the country, and Joe Rogan was 11th.
Wow.
So I was very proud of that. But that's because of screens. People have found that thanks to Instagram. That's a community. And it's funny. Instagram, I Bradbury'd it till about 70,000. I have no social media skills. And then a consultancy came over, or Ivy Street, to manage it pro bono. But initially there was hostility sometimes in that group, and I would have to monitor it. I almost don't have to do anything now because it's this beautiful community, and the Pop Culture Parenting podcast community is the best thing about that podcast, and it exists because of screens and because people can access information and others.
The culture is still, I'm agreeing with you, but to address that point, it is still dominant though, and maybe that's what it's on. It's
this is not what most of the conversation.
No. The Senate, right? I will go into childcare centres. I will have worked with maternal and child health nurses. There are still teachers that are phones in classrooms are no good, and we've got the whole phone ban sort of thing going on across schools and all the rest of it. And I think collectively as a culture, I think that's why, again, this idea of the centre of the digital child is an interesting thing, because we haven't got a modern idea of what is childhood. We've taken all the ideas of what childhood is. I remember talking to people once about digital apps, and a group of Masters of Education at Melbourne University, and talking to them. I was showing them an app and saying, this one's been inspired by Montessori. And I actually had an audience heckle me in a lecture saying, don't you dare bring Montessori into this, right? But if you think about who Maria Montessori was as an educationalist and what she wanted to explore about how children experience the world and what they would, I think your Montessoris and your Piagets would be wrapping their head around this technology as constructivists, going, oh my God, this is amazing. What can we do with this? And yet we hark back to golden times and don't move forward to say, well, what does it look like now? What does it look like for children to be facing climate anxiety and to be dealing with the world that we are leaving them? And to be dealing with a world where we know statistically we've created an idea of things being so unsafe that children are spending far less time outside, less time independently, and so they come inside to go on screens, and we say, they're not safe either. Don't go on those. Mm-hmm. It's a strange collective thinking around how we think about children today.
I want to use that as a way of kind of shifting to thinking about the bind that all of this puts parents into, and the kind of experiences of parents in this context. So we have this environment where there, as we've kind of gestured to, there's still a lot of conversation that's dominated by very kind of rigid ideas. One size fits all. Here's the amount of time. It's going to ruin your kid's brain. But we also have voices like yours and the messaging that you have described, bringing into your work as well. And so I want to ask a question, maybe particularly for Billy and Fiona, in terms of the work that you do that's very, focused, working directly with families. What kinds of concerns do they have? Do they bring concerns around, is it something that comes up in playgroup or in clinic? Because I'm trying to get at this question of is there a mismatch between the conversation that's happening and the actual experience of parents? Are they worried about the things that we're talking about? Are their worries being generated by the conversation that we're having? Is there a kind of disconnect there between the conversation around screen time and the experience of families? Or are families bringing a lot of concerns around this topic?
Yeah. So I've got a girl I'm seeing in clinic at the moment who was bullied so severely online that all the kids got together and beat her up so badly she was hospitalised. She was 14 when that happened. It happened to her again 6 months later. She left the school and it followed her because of online bullying, and she got beaten up again by another group of girls. And her mum didn't finish high school, has mental illness, is a single parent. This kid has neurodisability and other things, that make it really hard learning stuff and all these things. And mum's approach, understandably, is, well, she just can't have a social media profile. That's how I'll protect her. When the reality is the entire community should have protected her, not the lack of, not bullying online. And this is the problem with this zero tolerance crap that exists. We'll just put posters up and we'll have a zero tolerance to bullying. Bullying is a symptom of a community that is not healthy. It is not, I've said this lately and it really pisses some people off. The evidence shows us that kids that get expelled from schools, the school that does that is worse for the kids that stay, because they have primitive mechanisms to deal with a kid who is struggling. And that's the discourse needs to shift away from get off screens, get out of social media, stop playing video games. And it's like what you're talking about. The outdoor community is lost. We grew up running around and it doesn't happen anymore. And it's not because our parents were any better than us. It's just because the world has changed. And so people want to seek community. And these teenagers, I've got a parent that had to convince to let their kid have a social media account. He didn't have a single friend. He was a gorgeous, sociable boy. He lived rurally. And I was like, well, do you have any friends? Yeah, at school. And we always ask, do you see them outside of school? Never, because of how far away they live. And I was like, that doesn't make sense. You're really sociable and really nice. And you remember to ask me questions about my kids. I couldn't do that when I was your age. But it's because of his parents' social media approach that he doesn't have any friends. He's not having social opportunity. So it's a really important thing. And I think, I've got swept up in some stuff about these rules and bans and all this stuff. But we're missing an opportunity to have healthier communities by looking at that when we should be looking at what's actually going on.
Would it be fair to say then that you see in clinic examples where parents bring a lot of fear and anxiety to this issue that doesn't necessarily come out of observing something that's happened with their child and social media, but that they come with a kind of fear and anxiety that's shaping how they approach it from the start? Totally.
So we're all looking for levers, aren't we? I'm looking for a lever. My 15-month-old son isn't talking and I'm racked with guilt because it's because I don't have any time with him, and it's, I'm sitting there having a coffee, giving him as many words as I can in the 20 minutes I get with him in the morning. But, and I'm looking at that stuff. But the reality is all of us are looking at that stuff. We haven't given the world better tools to connect with their kids. That's the actual problem, is no one's taught them. It's a weird thing that we are focused on speech and we're focused on walking and riding a bike and all this stuff. But emotional and social skills have all the same components to them. But because people can't conceptualize it, but it's wild. If you think about how much time men spend getting their handicap better and money and everything at golf, they care way more about their kids, but they think it'll magically just happen, that relationship and supporting them and all that stuff. And that's the hard thing. A third of parents in this country on an RCH poll said that mental health problems in kids are best left alone. That's really worrying, because those are all the vulnerable kids. Yeah, we did it maybe right before the pandemic. I think it was 2021 maybe. But it's
disturbing.
Really disturbing. And so that's the thing that I can sense your frustration of I can't believe I'm still talking about this. But I think it's because it's an easy lever to understand and be I can move that.
But I think you're in the work that I do, the parents that come to our sessions that work with us, the joke I make often, and I really appreciate you talking about the bullying story with the level of complex needs there. Do you know what I mean? That child, it's not, yes, it was social media and bullying, but there obviously were a range of complex stuff going on in that child's life that needs a whole range of supports and sophisticated ways around it. But I often joke when parents come, well, your child will be fine. You've given up an hour or two on a Tuesday night to come and have a listen to a chat, like that's sort of the indicator from my perspective. But they're worried about the battlegrounds. They're actually worried about their relationships with their children and how they're emerging. And people see that technology or screens are in the way of that relationship. And so therefore I think that dominant culture of like, screen time, if I just reduce the amount of screen, the relationship will be better. And that's not what it is. Like at Project Rocket with our parents, we talk about the fact that the same thing we talk to students that we do school workshops with. It's sort of like saying, well, what do you value? What's important to you? So there's all these like family technology plans and things. And the first question of that plan should be, what do you enjoy doing together as a family?
Yeah, God.
We enjoy going to not how long do you think you should spend on the screen and where should screens be kept? Yeah. It should be like, we all enjoy walking our dog. Or gee, don't we love the footy? Let's prioritise those things. And then the relationship, and even the screen time, if that's still what you're worried about, takes care of itself. So, but I can see that, and I don't think enough people are, that's why the dominant paradigm of an easy out of if you just get 2 hours or if your child just spends less time, the relationship will improve. So I think parents are being sold a furphy.
Yeah, totally. I want to ask you something actually, but before I say that, you're just funny talking about the relationship because my partner is an obstetrics doctor and was doing this run of doing like 84 rostered hours a week on night shift, and I was like, Charlie was one at the time, wasn't sleeping, and I was so exhausted. I was watching TV just to try and wind down, and he wouldn't sleep, and I couldn't settle him, and so I was just like, and I just sat him next to me, and I was like, I'm okay with this. I was like, I'm not kidding. I thought for a second whether I needed to change it from Godzilla because I was watching Godzilla. I was like, maybe that's not right for a 1-year-old, but actually...
Maybe Bluey.
Yeah. But it was this time when I was with him, you know what I mean? And that's a hard thing. I see a lot of dads that, are doing a lot of stuff. I have dads that come into clinic and just sit on their phone the whole time and mum's telling me all the stuff they're worried about. Like, that's what I'm interested about hearing you talk to, because I was brought up in Frankston by a single mum. Like, she wasn't coming to a parenting talk. She wasn't reading a parenting book or a parenting podcast, listening to one. So how do we get to them? And obviously your work does this and your work does this, Dan, but how do we get to them en masse?
Look, honestly, I don't know. I work with a very tiny group of parents, but I think certainly this kind of discussion is certainly very, very helpful. I think single mums are doing a brilliant job. Hats off to them, because I honestly couldn't do it without the help of my husband. So I think, adding one more level of shame with a screen is absolutely the furthest thing from helpful in that particular space. It's quite interesting, and maybe I am an anomaly, I guess, in this space, but I don't make it an issue with the families that I work with. I really try to empower parents to... Your journey is big anyway, and anything that you can to try and lighten your load to actually make the time that you actually need to advocate for your child, or the time because they're all quality things for your child's development anyway. Yes, spending one-on-one time with your child is really, really important, and I'm certainly not suggesting that you should ever take away from that, but everything that a parent does, and especially single mums, because they are the mum, the dad, they're in a lot of ways, they're the therapist as well, you've got to be the friend too. I don't think adding shame for devices...
Because I reckon you've got a good answer to this. What do you do when the parent's like, my kid won't get off the iPad? And I'm really worried about it.
Yeah, so I talk a lot about transitional tools at that point, and we might talk about, it depends on the age of the child. Flexibility is something, mummy will be flexible, I try and actually give them words to talk about behaviours that they're actually doing day to day within things, so that then when they need to get that from a child, that they might be able to then resonate. Obviously with, in the early years it's tricky, and you sort of... How much mud can you throw at a wall before eventually it sticks? I think that's a weird space, but I'm not in the business of taking tablets off kids. I haven't done it with my own, and I certainly wouldn't tell a parent to do it. But if they're struggling with it, I would be looking at transition tools, and I would be getting an OT to probably come in to our sessions, so that we can work with them in a holistic approach of 360 degrees with that family. But it's not going to happen overnight. I mean, I hear it all the time about kids that are addicted to screens, or so their parents will tell you, but are they? Mine aren't.
I see, but I think therein lies the problem. Like, I think actually something like the Centre for the Digital Child and the kind of level of research we're doing is it's not about reaching parents, it's actually about reaching professionals that are responsible for delivering these messages. And we have a hell of a lot of parenting programs across the country, and PPP and sorts of positive parenting, and people out there doing it. So I think it's actually about building that evidence base to say, hey, the world's different now. And all the kinds of things that the digital child is learning and sharing about how these things work need to, and like you said, and just because you're a paediatrician doesn't mean you're across this, right? Like you said, a lot of your colleagues would not necessarily agree with you, right? But it's also about saying, well, where are the spaces that we're actually supporting the sector to broadly support parents in a better way?
You've handed me the perfect segue to the last question that I want to ask. We will throw open for questions in a second, but I want to get your thoughts on what all of this means for people who are in a position to kind of give advice to parents or to distribute information. And I am thinking here of researchers as an example, of myself, of colleagues in the centre, maybe people who are making resources, maybe people who are support workers as well. Fiona, when we were chatting before, you used the word noise. You said there's a lot of noise in this space, right? And it can be really hard for parents to kind of navigate that noise. And I was speaking at the start and trying to point to the fact that parents exist in this world where there's so much pressure on them. There's a lot going on. They're being given a lot of advice. They have a lot of other things to be worried about. So with all of that kind of context, what should we be aiming for in the way that we engage with parents around children's technologies so that we're not just more noise, more pressure, another person telling someone what they should or shouldn't be doing?
I'll come back to it again. I'm in the business of, well, I'm not in the business of it, but for me personally, and I can only speak to my own experience, but the families that I work to support, it's about building their capacity so that they can make executive choices to support their own children. And I think, you know, there isn't a one approach suits all, because it could be, you know, culturally, the demographic that you're working with, it could be spiritually that group of people that you're working with. I think everybody's own, I guess, parameters are different as well. So, you know, but for me, it's about breaking down the shame and just giving them the space to make choices that work for them in their own home. And I think staying across technology to the best of your ability, so as your child grows, your knowledge of what they're doing needs to grow with them. And I'm certainly navigating a strange space with my 13-year-old. Had that chat with Loretta earlier. But I think so long as as they get older, as long as you have an open line of communication with whoever it is that you're working with, be it your child or be it the families, I think it's about breaking down the stigma surrounding it and allowing people to parent their children the way they want to, with the supports in place to support that.
No notes?
I think that means researchers, but any professionals. Like, I think humility goes a hell of a long way.
I agree with that.
And I'm really glad you didn't use the word awesome, like parenting expert. It drives me absolutely nuts, because I think that's a problem. People think they have an answer. Like that idea that I'm doing something that's going to save and work for all the children. It's like, well, actually, no, have some humility. Any one of us is going to have the actual answer. It goes back probably like community. Like we all should, you know, the old proverb, it takes a village to raise a child, but that's the truth. Like, and we need to try and find ways to engage with that. And the community in the modern day is different. It is the Centre for the Digital Child. It is, you know, Project Rocket. It is the Royal Children's Hospital and Playgroups Victoria. And collectively, we should be collaborating more and working better together, and not sort of drawing lines in the sand and be like, well, here's where you do this for when your child has mental health stuff with Headspace, and here's where you do this. It's like, no, actually, we've got to recognise that, we need to collaborate and work together and have the humility to do that for parents and as in turn their children, because they'll know them better than anyone.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's the next generation, isn't it?
Billy, what should we be aiming for?
Yeah, I can try and be tight, which is I'm never that good at. But
give it a go.
So 1 in 7 kids in this country aged 4 to 17 years of age over a 12-month period has a clinical mental illness. And it's split even. 4 to 11 years of age, it's 13.6%. Everyone's like, it's just the teenagers. But I met a kid in clinic this morning who has clinical anxiety that's 5. Like, you know what I mean? We're seeing this all the time. These are really vulnerable parents. And to be honest, I'm in a pretty privileged position because almost all the families I meet in clinic are help seeking. Yeah. But we should listen more to families instead of jumping into, I need to tell you about this. It's like the nutrition argument's the same. Everyone's like, this is how many vegetables a kid needs to eat. Everyone knows that. It's just how. How do you get a kid to actually eat vegetables? Do you know what I mean? And there's actually heaps of evidence about that. It's so infuriating because the evidence is we provide the food at the time and what it is, they decide if they eat it. And you just want to tear your hair out when they just decide not to eat it. But that's the evidence. But they're pressure points. And Screentime's the same. It's a pressure point that makes parenting really difficult. I also think, the truth, you say the truth, the evidence is in it. Positive childhood experiences, adverse childhood experiences are abuse, neglect, household dysfunction. 1 in 5 kids in this country has 3 or more of them actively in their life. We talk about developmental trauma as if it's a historic thing. All these kids are living it. And the positive childhood experiences that are the antidote to that and the protective factor are 2 non-parental adults that take a genuine interest in me, feeling like I participate in community traditions, feeling like I'm a valued member of my school community, 1 parent at home that makes me feel safe, an adult I can talk to about my feelings, and friends that I genuinely connect with. So we've got to think about that stuff and move away from the destructiveness of this. I had one final thing that I was going to bang on about, but I can't remember what it was now.
Maybe you'll get lucky and someone in the audience will ask you
they'll jog your memory. I'll get you there.
The perfect question.
Just quickly, I remembered, restorative practice. Restorative practice has a place in this stuff. A lot of parents have heard negative stuff. We should call it out and say, how do we resolve how unhelpful all that messaging has been for you?